Let's talk about your heading up SORC, as it's described. You actually presided over the Serious Offender Review Council. You were chairman of the New South Wales Serious Offenders Review Council after retiring from the bench in 2005. Now, that is dealing with people who have minimum prison sentences of 12 years and obviously deciding the case for whether or not they should be released back into society.
Well, it's a bit more complex than that. The Serious Offenders Review Council is, except in one minor respect, purely an advisory body made up of 3 judicial members, 3 official members from the Department of Corrective Services, and up to about 5 or 6 or more community members. And its function is to advise the Commissioner of Corrective Services as to the classification and placement of serious offenders who, as you have said, are persons sentenced to serve 12 years, a minimum term of 12 years at one end of the scale, and at the other, anyone convicted of murder is automatically a serious offender, and there's a whole group between those two. The Commissioner of Corrective Services is not bound by the recommendation and can reject it entirely. We do not, and there's a misunderstanding generally abroad about the role of SORC in relation to parole. The parole body in New South Wales is the State Parole Authority, SPA. SORC can make a recommendation to SPA that a serious offender be considered by SPA for release on parole, in which case it's a matter entirely for SPA to decide whether or not that person is granted parole. SORC can also make a recommendation to SPA that it is not appropriate for a given serious offender to be considered for release on parole. When we make that negative recommendation, SPA, as a matter of practice and convention, follows it. In other words, it does not consider the person for parole. The statute, however, provides that in exceptional circumstances, notwithstanding SORC saying no, SPA can say yes. But in my years on SORC, that has never happened. So I suppose SPA catches the flak for the ultimate release on parole of various people, but SORC is an antecedent advisory or recommendatory body in relation to that.
So in governance terms, your role, SORC's role rather, was to counsel and to warn, if need be.
That's in relation to the State Parole Authority. That's one way of putting it. You certainly would not counsel or warn the Commissioner for Corrective Services because we can only make a recommendation.
All the same, though, did the Commissioner of Corrective Services pay heed to what SORC said?
In most cases, yes. Strangely enough, but he is not obliged to give reasons if he does not. That's a legal issue that might have to be revisited at some time.
Because there's not enough of a check and balance to that kind of power, you mean?
One thing should be made very clear about the Commissioner of Corrective Services, and I'm not personalising it to the present Commissioner, is that he is one of the most powerful officers in this state. But every component of the power exercisable by the Commissioner is in the Crime Sentence Administration Act or the Crime Sentence Administration Regulation. It's not as if the power is because the Commissioner happens to be Mr X or Ms Y. It's all statutory based. So it is the great value to me of having been chair of this body, is that for 18 years I was a common law trial judge or a criminal appeal judge sentencing people to jail. And now you see it all from the other end, as it were. The administration of sentences is an entirely different discipline to the excruciatingly complex discipline of imposing the sentence. And it's given me immense professional and intellectual.
Yes, I suppose it's that immensely difficult conflict between justice must be done and justice must be seen to be done, and there's always that tension, isn't there? And what you're really saying, in a sense, having had to go through the minutiae of cases as a judge, and now, in a sense, or during that time, but also now, I might say, the sense about how justice, in effect, has to be administered in a day-to-day way, that is the real crux of the problem, in a sense. And the thing is, there is such a mood all the time, usually fanned by the media, about increasing sentences and the like. I know many judges I've interviewed have said, you know, it's not nearly enough understanding about the way sentences are actually administered. But the problem for the typical police person, I suppose, if you like, is the business of they are bringing offenders before the courts all the time, and at the end of the day, there has to be some balance, I suppose, between what is right for that particular person and also the punishment, I suppose, that they have to wear.
Yeah, well, the essence the essence of sentencing is both the crime and the criminal. It has to be taken into account. That's the short form of putting it. The essence of the administration of the sentence, once it has been imposed, is to seek to ensure that that person returns to society rehabilitated and does not constitute a risk to society. Now, all these are very high ideals, and the world is imperfect, but we do our best. And the system in New South Wales is, as far as I understand it, compared to others, a highly sophisticated, humane, common sense system in terms of the administration of sentence. The imposition of sentence is still an extremely complex and difficult matter. And for anyone involved, whether it be a policeman, police officer or victim, to wrap his or her mind around the whole body of doctrines, principles, policies is almost impossible. It's hard enough for me at times. An interesting anecdote in this area, after I'd retired from the bench, I was asked to address victims of crime function, and I remembered well the last murder trial I did before I retired, and I remember the name of the accused, and during the course of this address, I made an admission that suddenly occurred to me, and it was this, that after 18 years of doing this, sentencing people to jail, who did I remember? The name of the accused. And the awful realisation was that I never remembered the name of the victim, which is a terribly sad state of affairs. And I've now met a lot of victims at conferences, and indeed I met the victims of my last trial. And I had to be reminded of their name, and I just thought, how sad that is. You know, what an imbalance that reflected in me, and probably in most judges will always remember the name of the criminal, but not necessarily the name of the victim.
Do victims' impact statements in any way act as a counter towards this problematic perception that you're talking about?
I think they're becoming very important in the trial, in the sentencing process, there is an argument that the introduction of the victim's role in effect triangulates the structure of the criminal trial by adding the third element. I'm wearing a yellow helmet.
Yes, victim impact statements.
They have the benefit for victims of
being able to express their grievance.
A cathartic effect, expressing their grievance. There are rules about how they're taken into account by the sentencing judge and what weight should be attached to them. In many cases, it is hoped that there is some form of closure. But there's another aspect that there is a scheme whereby prisoners, convicted prisoners in custody and victims can get together. It's known as restorative justice.
A Maori principle originally, I believe.
A
Maori principle.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, I believe that first originated in New Zealand, but there have been other very similar approaches around the world too.
Yes. And I know of one case in which it has worked very well. It is a matter entirely between the prisoner and the victims. The SORC plays no part in it. But if it works, it can be of great evidentiary value in terms of, well, this prisoner is profoundly remorseful and has done all that he can possibly do and is a far safer prospect to be released back into the community. If it doesn't work, it's not held against the prisoner, in the sense that the prisoner might offer and he's knocked back by the victims. We don't hold that against the prisoner. That's why it's a matter for them. If it does work, that means it reflects that prisoner is now a different person to what he or she was when admitted to custody.
What about correspondingly with the victims, though? In cases where, for whatever reason, the prisoner does not show remorse, there's no sense of closure for the victim, is there?
None. It's terrible. One can understand why there are many victims who want nothing to do with the perpetrator of the crime against them. And this is particularly so in these awful pack rape cases of about 8 to 10 years ago. That you can understand. I think they are entitled to draw their line where they want to draw it and when they want to draw it. I suppose every victim is. But it's when it does work, I think it's valuable. If it doesn't work, well, that's because you're dealing with human beings and they're entitled to take their position.
During all these years of presiding over cases and then more recently with your involvement with the Serious Offenders Review Council, do you often find your mind turning to that old and oft-cited Christian ethos of if someone strikes you on the one cheek, offer them the other cheek? Do you find yourself ever thinking, really that can't be made to work in a modern society?
Turning the other cheek or offering it?
I remember in some cases it's actually said offered, not turning. I know turning is the one we mostly say, but I have read it originally being meant to mean offer.
No, I don't think that works. I think we would be more likely to have the response is more likely to be the older one, the eye for an eye. In fact, at my age now, I'm observing even in Sydney society, of the Sydney population, if not elsewhere, just a general decline in behavioural standards. I walk around the streets a little more observant than I was when I was a sitting judge or a practising lawyer, and so I see more lawbreakers at large on the streets. It's ranging from anything from using their mobile phone in their car to walking with an unleashed dog. That might sound trivial, but if they're not concerned about that, obeying the law to that level, where do they start being concerned?
So that then raises a really big question in my mind. With all your years of experience in defamation, and over the years there's been so much lip service with regard to freedom of speech, particularly in our culture. Where there's freedom, has there been a lessening of responsibility? And has this then flowed through to the behaviour that you're describing because of the greater sense of personal liberty, personal freedom? There's been a drop, if you like, in people's sense of responsibility.
I think that's one explanation. The greater the freedom, the less of the responsibility, and the greater the desire to make them. The worst case is I don't care how I go about it. I am free to do X, and nothing will stand in my way. I think that has affected behavioural standards. That people can set up their own blog and fight back.
Those are sometimes ending up in the courts too, though.
Ah, yes, yeah. But I think the courts are going to have to yield to technology. I think that I hope to see that in my lifetime. But it's wonderful that there's this mechanism to respond. Which didn't exist before. In other words, the modern media renders the citizen less helpless than that person used to be in the face of the untrammelled power of the instruments of mass communication. We can be now instruments of mass communication.
The trouble is it often takes place under a cloak of anonymity, and there are many, if you like, trolls, as they call them in the internet, who write pretty revolting things about other people, and they are publishing and certainly not perishing, as it were. It's very hard to catch up with them. And I wonder if you've sometimes found yourself thinking, is it a bit of a coward's castle in its own right?
Well, certainly, yes, it can be a coward's castle. I wasn't thinking in terms of the cowards.
I know.
I was thinking in terms of those who would have the strength of character to respond in defiance of the powers that have been used to get, and that people can just twitter away, blithely indifferent, if not completely forgetful.
You know what
so vulnerable.
You know what I.
If in your case, when it was you, presumably your engineer, and the person on the phone, and only you're dealing with three people, one presses the button here, the equivalent of the person calling in is in fact might be speaking to 500,000 people. And who's going to decide to press the button, let alone where the button's going to be technologically? That's another great joy for internet service providers, I suppose, too.